Today's video, we're going to do some Linux tricks for the power user with your Apple II Pi so you can get the most out of it in both the emulated Apple II GS environment and the native Linux environment. So let's go ahead and boot our Apple II Pi system here. As we wait for the boot procedure, our Apple II is now booted, and we will continue on to the emulated Apple II GS. And we'll go ahead and exit out of our emulator. Back to the Linux desktop. Now what we want to do with this computer setup is to give ourselves the option of booting into a Linux desktop directly or a Linux command prompt. So what we're going to do here, let's make this bigger so we can see it. And we will use the Raspberry config program, Rasby config, and what we want to do is change our boot option. Currently it is set to automatically boot into the Apple II user, but we want to give ourselves the option of going into the Apple II user or the standard Raspberry Pi user. So if we go to our boot login and say we want to go into just a console requiring the user to log in. We can also change the splash screen back. For whatever reason, when I run this, it will reset our splash screen. So I'm just going to re-enable that. If you have a Raspberry Pi 3 with built-in Wi-Fi, you can actually enable the Wi-Fi functionality from this as well. Most users will probably have just the Raspberry Pi 0 or 1 or 2, which doesn't include that functionality, but this is where you would enable it if you did have a Raspberry Pi 3. Alright, so we're going to finish here, and we're going to reboot. As it shuts down, we will notice that instead of going right into the emulator, we can choose, and we have to log in now. So we're back to the standard Linux way of logging into the computer, which is using a username and a password. There are two users on the Apple II Pi SD card as it comes from Ultimate Apple II or downloaded. One is the default Apple II. The default Pi user from the Raspberry Pi Foundation login is Pi, but the password has been updated. Now with the Apple II Pi distribution is Apple, the number 2, followed by Pi. We now are in the command line version of Linux using the Pi user. We can start our GUI with the command start X, and that will bring us to the Raspberry Pi GUI as shipped by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. This hasn't been modified in any way. Does not look like the Apple II user. So we see that we have basically a standard Raspberry Pi. We can still use our Apple II peripherals, our keyboard and mouse. They operate just like Linux devices, but we can interact with our Raspberry Pi just like we would with any keyboard and mouse. Log out of our Raspberry Pi, our Pi user, and now we can go back to our login prompt and log in as Apple II. The password for the Apple II user is forever. Who doesn't want Apple II forever? Now, as we log into this account, it does its standard loading of the Apple II GS emulator, just like it had been doing automatically. Again, we will follow the procedures of exiting out of here that we had done previously and return to the GUI. But here's something we may want to do, that because this is the emulated user and we may want to just run the emulator in this version, is to load the joystick driver automatically. So let's see how this works. We'll only use one terminal window, and we will increase our font size so we can see it. If we look at all the files here, we won't be able to see that one. There's a file called bash login or .bash login. This is the script that runs when this user logs in, and its job is to mount the Apple II drives under Linux, then run the GS emulator, and when that exits, run the Linux desktop GUI. So this is where all that is controlled. If we want to modify this script so that it will load the joystick driver, then we should do something very similar to this. We're going to do nano.bash login, and we're just going to add a line here that will load our A2 joystick driver, so that the next time we log in with this user, the joystick driver will also be loaded in along with the mounting of the Apple II peripherals. We just save that. And now it will automatically load our joystick driver. If we restart, or reboot here, now one thing to note about the Apple II Pi is that the Apple II and the Raspberry Pi are actually two independent computers, so it's possible to reboot them independently. So here we're rebooting the Pi while the Apple II waits. If, on the other hand, your Apple II gets hung up and you need to reboot it, you can just reboot it like you always would with a control reset, or with the Apple IIe and 2GS, the Open Apple control reset for a complete reboot. So here we are back at our prompt. We're going to log in with Apple II. The password is forever. And now we're going to log in directly to the Apple IIGS emulator. This time, as we load BASIC real quick, we are going to print our joystick values. And now we recognize that our joystick driver has been automatically loaded by our .bash login script. So we will always have our joystick available to us inside of the emulator. So that's really what I wanted to show you with the power usage, if you will, switching between our Apple II emulation environment and then the standard run-of-the-mill Raspberry Pi desktop environment. So that's how you can get the most out of your Apple II Pi setup. Thanks for watching. Hope you liked it.